Hi everyone, Talia from Zart Art, and today we're going to be making a Victorian style clay slab house. Okay, so here we have our little example of what we'll be creating. So a Victorian style house is noted for its use of brick and wood textures. It uses bright and deep colours, so greens, reds, yellows and blues, and it's traditionally asymmetrical as well, so we'll be using some of those details and elements in our own work. So this is made from air drying clay, and it's a very simple slab that we'll be working on, so it's great for junior year levels working with clay, so around middle primary and up can create a project like this. So to begin, we're going to start by using our air drying clay. I've got Oz clay here, which is a really nice air drying clay because it's easy to mold and easy to use, and what I'm going to do is roll out a slab of my clay with the assistance of these wooden slats to make sure that I get an even thickness. So what I'm working on is a silicone mat. What you want to do is work on something that's not going to stick to the clay, so you can easily peel it off and move it. So a silicone mat is perfect, or even a wooden board will work fine too. So when I'm pushing my clay down, I'm just trying to get it to be a little bit more even so it's easier to roll instead of trying to roll a ball. I'm also working at about an A5 size for my house, so I need about 2 fistfuls of clay, and I'm expecting there'll be a bit of excess, so it's better to have too much and roll it out and then realize you can cut it away than having not enough and then adding later. So when you're just putting down your wooden slats, make sure it's within the width of your rolling pin, and again I'm working at about A5, so it doesn't need to be too big or too far apart. So while you're working, you probably want to be standing up so you can put a bit of pressure into your rolling pin, which will help the clay spread out a bit more than if you're sitting, and it's harder to get enough force behind it. So the slats I'm using are about 1 centimetre in width. You can always go for a larger wooden slat and then go thinner as you're rolling. What I'm doing with the Oz clay is working at about 1 centimetre, because if you go any thinner, then it is likely your Oz clay will snap because it's still a little bit fragile even for an air drying clay. Now it's a good idea when you're working with clay to always have a little bit of water close by, because the clay can dry out pretty quickly, especially if you're working in a warm room. So just keep applying a little bit of moisture as you go. Okay, so now I've got enough clay to fit an A4 size. What I'm going to do now is use one of my clay tools. I'm going to draw the design of the house into my clay. So it's a good idea if you're working with students, especially younger students, to have your design already drawn out. So research Victorian houses, get them to make their design, and then the next lesson you can go through this process of rolling the clay and then drawing into it with your tool. What's great about drawing in clay is if you make a mistake, your line isn't quite straight enough, you can just go over it with a little bit of water and get rid of that line like an eraser. Now I've drawn my rough design for my house, I'm going to use my potter's knife and just cut around the outline. now I've got my little house cut out. What I'm going to do is add on that second layer to my slab, so to create a little bit more of a 3D effect and to create that depth. So using some of the clay that I've cut, and if you don't have excess clay, then just use your wooden slats and your rolling pin to roll out a bit more. I'm going to cut some areas, so I'm going to do my rooftops and this little section in the middle as another layer, and maybe even my door. If you're feeling lucky, I might do that too. You feeling lucky? So now we've got our shapes cut out, and just make sure they're the right size. Now to join the air drying clay, it's a little bit different to natural clay. If you were using natural clay for this project, then that's absolutely fine, and then you could fire it and then move on. But because this is air drying clay, we don't need to go through the steps of using slip, but what I will do is score the surface that I'm attaching onto, as well as the back of the piece I'm attaching. And then I'm just going to apply a little bit of water instead of slip, which you would use for natural clay. Place those on top. And then with my wooden clay tool, I'm just going to join those edges by scraping a little bit of clay down to the section underneath. And that should join the air drying clay nicely. So I'm going to repeat that for the rest of my shapes. My house has its second layer of clay. Now with the excess air drying clay, just make sure it doesn't dry out. So it's always good to put little pieces that you're not using back together because they will dry out less quickly. Just add a little bit of water and wrap it up if you are done with it. But the problem with air drying clay is once it dries, it is never coming back to life, unlike natural clay, which you can reconstitute in a bucket of water if it fully dries out. Not with this one, so make sure you don't have too much wastage. Now, the next step is to add our texture. I am going to use my clay tools to create the texture. So I've got a few different ribbon tools here, and I can draw some lines with my potter's knife, as well as my little needle tool. So if you're working on this project over multiple days or multiple weeks, then what you can do to keep your clay nice and moist to use for the next lesson is just wrap the whole project in a plastic bag. So if you're working on wooden boards, then it's very easy just to put the whole board into a big plastic garbage bag, tie a knot in the end, and it should be fine to use for the next lesson if it is airtight. Now we've got some of the texture in our house using our ribbon tools. So I'm going to put that to the side. So the next step is to add color to our house. So I've got a pre-done house here that's nice and dry. Depending on your climate, your clay could dry within 24 hours or it could take a couple of days. This one's been drying for about 3 days and it is pretty dry, so that will be good to work on. So the process here is to use oil pastels to colour in the surface of our house, and then we're going to use watercolour paint, so just a black watercolour, or you could use Indian ink as well, to paint over the top of our oil pastel to create a resist effect. So put our example to the side and I'll just wipe down my hands. Okay, so we've got our house, we've got our oil pastels, and you probably want to have a discussion about what kinds of colours would be used in the Victorian era. So using deep colours, you can use greens, blues, reds, but making sure that they fit into that aesthetic. So have a look at the houses as a bit of an example first. Now, as you can see, this house has a rough texture, which I've created with the texture plate. So that was pressed into the clay to create this rough surface. So using either texture plates or your ribbon tools and clay tools will work really well for this project. Now that I've coloured in the house with oil pastel, and you can do a really rough colour. So as you can see, I haven't layered a whole lot of pastel onto the house to cover every crevice. We do want some bits of the clay exposed so that the watercolour can sink into those areas and create that nice contrast between the colour and really bring out that texture. So I've just got some standard watercolour paints. Again, you can use Indian ink. Now what I'm going to do is use a pretty thin layer of the watercolour and paint it over the house. It's handy to have a cloth or some paper towel with you just to dab away that excess watercolour, because you don't want it to cover too much of the colour from the oil pastel. Now I've finished adding watercolour to my house, and you can see it's created that resist effect. So anywhere that I didn't colour in with the oil pastel has turned into that black colour, so it really does bring out some of those textures. If you don't quite like where the black has turned out, what you can do is with your oil pastel, go back over some of those sections to try and lighten them up a little bit, like I'm doing here, just to try and get a little bit more brightness back into it. But otherwise, I'm quite happy with how those have turned out, and it's a really great lesson to teach students those basic clay skills, how to add textures and working in that slab style. If you're completing this project, you can do it with air drying clay or natural clay, both will work, and it's suitable for middle primary school students and up. So if you want to extend it and make it a little bit more difficult, then really look at those textures and trying to build those realistic textures into your work. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.